For 60 years, the ground in Trenton, Michigan, vibrated with the power of the most violent engines ever made. This was the home of the Hemi. It was the loudest place on earth. But today, it is a ghost. Why did Chrysler destroy the very fortress that powered the American dream? This is a dark story. It involves toxic soil, corporate betrayal, and the brutal decision to erase history to save a balance sheet. To save the company, they didn't just close this plant, they murdered it. This is the silent story of the Trenton engine giant. Chapter 1. The Blood in the Clay. To understand the death of this giant, you have to understand its birth. And to understand its birth, you have to look at the dirt. You have to look at the geography of Downriver. Trenton, Michigan isn't Detroit. Not really. It sits in a region known locally as Downriver, a collection of 18 communities that sprawl south from the Detroit city limits along the western bank of the Detroit River. In the local lexicon, Downriver is a place apart. It is a blue-collar, hardened artery of heavy industry. While Detroit had the glamour of the corporate headquarters and the design studios, Downriver had the grit. This was where the steel was made. This was where the chemicals were mixed. This was where the power plants burned coal to keep the lights on in the executives' offices 20 miles north. Before the factories came, this land was marsh. It was swamp. It was heavy, dense clay soil that clung to your boots and refused to let go. It was land that fought you. But by the late 1940s, the world had changed. World War II was over. The Axis powers had been crushed, largely by the overwhelming industrial might of Southeast Michigan. The United States stood atop the wreckage of the global economy as the undisputed king of manufacturing. We were the only major power left with our factories intact. The boys were coming home from Europe and the Pacific. The GI Bill was pumping money into the economy. The suburbs were exploding outward from the cities like a shockwave. And everyone, literally everyone, needed a car. The Chrysler Corporation was sitting on a mountain of cash in 1950, but they had a problem, a serious problem. They were stuffy. They were conservative. They were run by bean counters and engineers who prioritized headroom over horsepower. While Ford and General Motors were looking toward the future with high-compression overhead valve V8 engines, Chrysler was still building cars that felt pre-war. They were reliable, sure, but they were boring. Chrysler needed a new heart. They needed to modernize, and fast. They needed a facility that could produce the next generation of engines, not by the dozens, but by the millions. They needed a facility that could take raw earth in one end and spit out horsepower at the other. They chose Trenton for its strategic genius. It was perfect logistics. The property was located right on the major rail lines that connected Detroit to the rest of the continent. It was close to the Detroit River for water intake, a crucial detail because casting engine blocks requires millions of gallons of water to cool the molten metal and the machinery. And it was close to the massive steel mills like McLouth Steel that lined the waterfront. The supply chain was measured in blocks, not miles. When ground was broken in 1951, the scale of the project was terrifying. This wasn't just a factory, it was a fortress. The plan called for a facility that would cover over 1 million square feet initially, and eventually sprawl to more than 2 million. That is 45 acres under a single roof. Imagine 45 football fields of concrete, steel, and glass enclosed in a box designed to contain fire. The architecture was Albert Kahn style, brutalist, functional, and imposing. It was known as a monitor roof design, with raised sections of glass to let heat escape and light enter. It was designed to do one thing: facilitate the flow of material. There were no frills here, no marble lobbies, no art on the walls. This was a place of fire, molten metal, and noise. It was a machine for making machines. But there was a shadow hanging over the construction from day one. You have to remember the time period. 1951. This was the height of the Cold War. The Korean War was raging. The Soviet Union had the bomb. The fear of nuclear annihilation was the background radiation of American life. Every person in Detroit knew a simple, terrifying fact. Detroit was a target. If the Soviets were going to drop the bomb, they weren't going to drop it on a cornfield in Iowa. They were going to drop it on the industrial capacity of the United States. They were going to drop it here. So, the Trenton Engine Plant wasn't just built as a car factory. It was built with a dual purpose. It was built with the capability to churn out military hardware if the world went to hell again. It was designed to be converted. It was part of the strategic defense of the nation, and hidden within its design history was a piece of technology that speaks to the darkness of that era more than anything else. A piece of technology that became a local legend, a mechanical banshee that terrified children and reassured adults. The Chrysler air raid siren. It looked like something out of a sci-fi nightmare. It wasn't an electric buzzer. It was a massive, rotating siren powered by a 180-horsepower Hemi V8 engine. It was manufactured right here in the Trenton complex during the Cold War years. When they tested these sirens at the plant, the sound was apocalyptic. We are talking about 138 decibels measured at 100 feet. That is louder than a jet engine at takeoff. That is louder than a gunshot next to your ear. It was a sound so powerful that it could physically knock a man down if he stood too close. Its vibration was so intense that it could shatter windows. Locals swore, and this is part of the Trenton folklore, that when the sirens fired up for testing on humid days, the sheer acoustic pressure vibrating the water molecules in the air could turn fog into rain. Think about that. A scream so loud, it literally changed the weather. That was the energy baked into this soil from the very beginning. A factory built on a swamp, designed for war, powered by the most violent engines ever conceived. When the doors opened in 1952, the locals didn't know it yet, but they were living next to a sleeping dragon, and when it woke up, it would shake the world. Chapter 2. The Foundry of Hell. When the ribbons were cut and the furnaces lit in 1952, the Trenton Engine Plant came online with a fury. It didn't ramp up slowly. It exploded into production. At first, the mission wasn't about speed. It was about volume. The post-war boom was a hungry beast that could not be sated. Americans were buying cars faster than Detroit could build them. The waiting lists were months long. The early engines coming out of Trenton were workhorses. They were reliable, heavy, iron lumps designed to push massive chrome-laden sedans down the newly built interstate highways. To understand why this place was so special, and why its loss is so significant, you have to understand the physical reality of the North Plant. It wasn't like a modern assembly plant. Today, most car factories are just assembly points. Parts arrive in boxes from China or Mexico, robots bolt them together, and a car rolls off the line. It's clean. It's sterile. Trenton North was not sterile. It was a place of transformation. It was integrated. It didn't just assemble engines. It birthed them from the elements. The process started at the casting line. This was the heart of the beast. Imagine a river of molten iron, heated to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The plant took raw pig iron, scrap steel, and limestone, and fed it into massive cupola furnaces that roared 24 hours a day. These furnaces were like volcanoes contained in steel silos. They consumed fuel and ore and spit out liquid fire. The heat in the casting department was unimaginable. It wasn't just hot, it was oppressive. It was a physical weight on your chest. Former workers, the old-timers who were there in the 50s and 60s, talk about the casting line as a preview of hell. In the summer, with the Michigan humidity at 90% and the furnaces running full blast, the temperature on the floor could exceed 120 degrees. The air shimmered. You couldn't see straight across the room because of the heat distortion. The smell was distinct. It was a mix of burning sand, because the molds for the engines were made of compressed sand and binding agents, ozone from the welding arcs, and the sharp, sulphurous tang of molten iron. It was a smell that permeated everything. It got into your clothes. It got into the upholstery of your car in the parking lot. It got into your skin. You could shower for an hour after your shift, scrubbing with heavy pumice soap, and your wife would still smell the foundry on you when you went to bed. And the noise. The noise was constant. It was rhythmic and chaotic all at once. The deep, bass thump, thump, thump of the sand molding machines compressing the molds. The high-pitched shriek of the cutting tools shaving steel in the machining department. The roar of the furnaces. The clatter of the conveyor chains dragging thousands of pounds of iron overhead. It was a sensory assault that never stopped. The plant ran 3 shifts. The fires never went out. If the furnaces cooled down, the iron would harden and destroy the equipment, costing millions. So the dragon had to be fed, constantly, day and night, Christmas and Easter. In this environment, men worked without the safety regulations we have today. There were no ergonomic lifts. If an engine block needed to be moved, you moved it. If a machine jammed, you reached in with a pry bar. Fingers were lost. Backs were broken. Hearing was destroyed. It was a brutal exchange. You gave the company your body, and in exchange, the company gave you a middle-class life. In 1959, this foundry of hell began producing an engine that would become a legend, but not for its speed. It was called the Slant 6. It was a weird engine. It was an inline 6-cylinder, which was a standard design, but the engineers at Chrysler decided to tilt the cylinder bank 30 degrees to the side. Why? To lower the profile of the engine so it would fit under the lower, sleeker hoods of the new, compact cars like the Plymouth Valiant and the Dodge Dart. The Slant 6 wasn't fast. It wasn't sexy. It didn't make a good sound. It sounded like a sewing machine gargling gravel, but it was unkillable. It was the cockroach of the automotive world. The block was so rigid, and the bottom end so over-engineered, that you could practically drain the oil, fill the crankcase with sand, and drive it to California. It powered taxis, delivery trucks, and family grocery getters for decades. It became the backbone of the company's reputation for engineering. Trenton churned these engines out by the millions. They were the bread and butter of the Chrysler Corporation. They paid the bills. They kept the lights on. But while the Slant 6 was doing the heavy lifting on the main line, the engineers in the back rooms were working on something else. They were bored with efficiency. They were bored with reliability. They were looking for something more visceral. They were working on a monster. And the North plant was about to shift gears from building appliances to building weapons. Chapter 3. The Golden Age of Violence. The 1960s changed the rhythm of the world. The baby boomers were coming of age. They were getting their driver's licenses, and they had money in their pockets. And more importantly, they didn't want the cars their fathers drove. They didn't want safety. They didn't want reliability. They didn't want sensible beige sedans that got good gas mileage and lasted 10 years. They wanted speed. They wanted noise. They wanted danger. They wanted to feel something. And the engineers at Trenton were ready to give it to them. This is the moment where the story of the Trenton Engine Plant shifts from industrial history to American mythology. This is the era of the big block. The plant began producing the B and RB series engines, the 383, the 440. These were massive V8 engines with huge bores and long strokes, engines that didn't just spin, they hammered. They were designed to create the kind of tire-shredding torque that could twist a car frame. But the king of them all, the engine that would turn this factory into a holy site, arrived in 1964. The 426 Hemi. To understand, the Hemi wasn't really a street engine, it was a weapon. It was designed originally for NASCAR racing. It featured hemispherical combustion chambers, hence the name Hemi, which allowed for massive valves and unrestricted airflow. It was an air pump of terrifying efficiency. When Chrysler unleashed it on the Daytona 500 in 1964, it didn't just win, it decimated the field. It was so dominant, so unfair, that NASCAR officials panicked and banned it from competition. They told Chrysler, if you want to race this engine, you have to sell it to the public. You have to prove it's a production engine, not a prototype. And so, the task of building these street-legal race engines fell to the workers at Trenton. Building a Hemi was different from building a Slant 6. The Slant 6 line was a river of efficiency, moving fast, assembled by workers doing the same motion every 30 seconds. A Hemi was precision work. It was painted a screaming, violent orange. It was massive. It barely fit between the fenders of the cars it was put into. It required different tolerances. It required hand finishing. It required a different level of care. The plant developed a split personality. It was a Jekyll and Hyde situation. On one side of the aisle, under the fluorescent lights, you had the relentless, humming production of the economy engines, the ones paying the electric bill. On the other side, in the shadows, they were building the orange monsters. They were building the 440 six-pack, an engine topped with 3 two-barrel carburetors that dumped fuel into the cylinders like a fire hose. The culture inside the plant during the late 60s was wild. It reflected the chaos of the outside world. This was the Vietnam era. It was the era of protests, of riots in Detroit, of a cultural revolution. And inside Trenton, it was the era of the shop rat. The workers were making good money, union money. They were buying boats, they were buying cottages up north, and they were buying the very muscle cars they built. The parking lot at Trenton wasn't filled with economy cars. It was a car show. It was filled with Dodge Chargers, Plymouth Roadrunners, and Super Bs. When the shift change whistle blew at 3:00 p.m., the sound of tires screeching onto Van Horn Road was deafening. It was a daily celebration of horsepower. Stories from that time are legendary, bordering on folklore. There were the liquid lunches at the bars across the street. There were high-stakes dice games in the locker rooms while the line was moving. There were rivalries between the shifts. But despite the chaos, when the line started moving, the work got done. There was a pride there that you don't see anymore. You weren't just tightening a bolt on an appliance, you were building the fastest machines on the street. You were building the machines that owned Woodward Avenue on Saturday nights. The defining sound of that era was the dynamometer room. A dyno is a small, soundproofed room where they hook a finished engine up to a machine to measure its power. They run it wide open, full throttle, red line. They push the engine to the breaking point to make sure it holds together. At most car factories, dyno testing is routine. But at Trenton, when they were testing a batch of 426 Hemis, the sound was different. It wasn't a hum, it was a scream. The sound would bleed through the soundproofing. It would vibrate through the concrete floor. It would escape the ventilation stacks. It was a roar that let everyone in the city of Trenton know that the giant was awake. Residents living blocks away could tell you what kind of engines were running that day, just by the pitch of the vibration in their kitchen windows. It felt like it would last forever. It felt like American dominance was a law of physics, as immutable as gravity. We had the biggest engines, the cheapest gas, and the wildest cars. But gravity is a cruel mistress, and giants fall harder than anyone else. Chapter 4: The Oil Shock and the Humiliation. The party ended in October of 1973. It didn't taper off. It slammed into a brick wall. The OPEC oil embargo hit the United States like a hammer to the chest. Political turmoil in the Middle East led to a sudden restriction of oil exports. Overnight, the lifeblood of the Trenton Engine Plant, cheap, high-octane gasoline, disappeared. Gas prices didn't just go up, they quadrupled. But it wasn't just the price. It was the availability. Gas stations ran dry. People were waiting in lines that stretched for blocks, idling for hours just to fill up their tanks. Fights broke out at pumps. The American psyche, which had been defined by the freedom of the open road, suddenly felt trapped. Overnight, the 440 Magnum and the 426 Hemi went from being heroes to villains. They became symbols of excess. They became symbols of stupidity. Nobody wanted a car that got 8 miles to the gallon anymore. They couldn't afford to feed it. The market shifted violently. Americans looked at the massive, heavy Chryslers sitting on the dealership lots and walked right past them. They went to the Datsun dealer. They went to the Toyota dealer. They bought Hondas that looked like toys compared to a Dodge Charger, but ran like Swiss watches and sipped fuel through a straw. For the workers at Trenton, this was a psychological blow that is hard to describe. They had spent 20 years mastering the art of big horsepower. They were the blacksmiths of the V8. Now they were told that their craft was obsolete. It wasn't just that sales were down. It was that the culture had turned against them. The big blocks were phased out. The Hemi was killed. The tooling was ripped out. The orange paint was put away. The plant had to retool. And it wasn't a graceful transition. It was a desperate, panicked scramble for survival. Chrysler Corporation was bleeding money. By the late 1970s, the company was technically bankrupt. They were losing millions of dollars a day. They had no new products in the pipeline. They had massive inventory of cars nobody wanted. Lee Iacocca took over the company and went to Washington, D.C. to beg the federal government for loan guarantees. It was a national humiliation. The company that had built the arsenal of democracy was now asking for a handout to make payroll. To save the company, Trenton Engine had to pivot. They had to stop building legends and start building the savior, the 2.2-litre four-cylinder. If the Hemi was a lion, the 2.2 was a hamster. It was a small, overhead cam, four-cylinder engine designed for the new K car, the Dodge Aries and the Plymouth Reliant. These were boxy, boring, front-wheel drive economy cars designed to do one thing: save Chrysler from death. And they worked. The K car was a massive sales success. It was cheap, it was efficient, and it fit the times. It pulled Chrysler back from the brink of liquidation. But inside Trenton, the atmosphere had changed. The darkness had begun to creep in. The swagger was gone. The roaring dyno rooms were quieter now, buzzing with the high-pitched whine of small displacement engines. They were building appliance motors. The shop rats, who used to brag about building the fastest cars on the street, were now assembling engines that struggled to merge onto the highway without shaking. The joy of the work evaporated. It became a grind. And as the company squeezed every penny to pay back the government loans, the physical plant began to suffer. Decades of hard use, 24 hours a day, were taking their toll on the North plant. The roof, which had survived the Korean War and the Vietnam War, began to leak. Buckets were placed over expensive machinery to catch the rainwater. The floors were soaked in decades of oil and cutting fluid, turning the concrete black and slick. The ventilation systems were clogged. Chrysler, perpetually short on cash even after the bailout, didn't have the money to properly modernize or maintain the massive North plant. They kept patching it together. They kept it running with duct tape, wire, and prayer. They ran the machines until they broke, fixed them cheaply, and ran them again. It was becoming a dark, gritty, dangerous place. The windows, once kept clean to let in the daylight, were layered with grime and soot. The lighting was dim. It became a place where you went to earn a paycheck to survive, not a place where you went to make history. But the neglect wasn't just cosmetic. It wasn't just peeling paint and leaking roofs. Beneath the surface, something much more dangerous was happening. The years of production at all costs were coming back to haunt them. The ground itself was becoming poisonous. Chapter 5. The Toxic Legacy. But the darkness at Trenton wasn't just emotional. It wasn't just the humiliation of building slow cars in a fast world. It was chemical. You cannot run a massive engine foundry and machining plant for 50 years without leaving a scar on the earth. The process of making engines is inherently dirty. It involves heavy metals, solvents, cutting fluids, and industrial lubricants. It involves fire and chemistry on a scale that is hard to comprehend. For the first 30 years of the plant's life, the standard industrial practice regarding waste was simple. If you spilled something, you washed it down the drain, or you let it soak into the floor, or you buried it in the back lot. We didn't know better, or perhaps we just didn't care enough to ask the questions. The priority was production. The priority was beating the Soviets. The priority was speed. The environment was an afterthought, a limitless resource that could absorb whatever we poured into it. Beneath the concrete slabs of the Trenton North plant, the soil was drinking. It was drinking hydraulic fluids. It was drinking machining oils. It was drinking PCBs, the carcinogenic compounds used in electrical, transformers, and hydraulic systems. It was drinking what the workers called amber oil, a heavy, pungent cutting fluid used to keep the drill bits cool as they bored into cast iron. The environment inside the plant was hazardous too. The high-speed machining lines threw up a mist of oil and coolant that hung in the air like a fog. On the foundry side, the air was thick with silica dust and binding agents. Old-timers talk about the Trenton cough. It was a dry, hacking cough that didn't go away on the weekends. The smell of the plant permeated your clothes, your car, your skin. It was a sweet, metallic, oily smell. You couldn't wash it off. It went home with you. It lived in your laundry. It lived in your pores. As environmental regulations tightened in the 1980s and 90s, the true cost of the Golden Age began to reveal itself. The bill was coming due. Surveys of the land revealed that the ground was contaminated. There were hotspots of heavy metals. There were plumes of solvents moving slowly through the groundwater. This wasn't unique to Trenton. It was the story of every major industrial site in the Rust Belt. But at Trenton, because of the sheer volume of engines produced, millions upon millions of them, the concentration was significant. This invisible poison became a major factor in the decision that would eventually seal the fate of the North plant. Chrysler was looking to the future. They needed to modernize. They needed efficient, clean, robotic manufacturing to compete with the Japanese and the Germans. They needed to build engines with tolerances measured in microns, not thousandths of an inch. They looked at the old North plant with cold, accountant eyes. They saw the leaking roof that would cost millions to replace. They saw the inefficient layout, designed for a different era of manufacturing when energy was cheap and labor was plentiful. They saw the low ceilings that made installing modern robots difficult, and they saw the toxic soil beneath the foundation. Saving the North Plant wasn't just expensive, it was impossible. To fix it, you would have to tear it apart anyway. You couldn't just scrub the floors, you had to dig up the earth. The very ground that supported the arsenal of democracy had become a liability on a balance sheet. Chapter 6. The Tale of Two Factories. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new vision emerged for the site. Chrysler, then under the ownership of Daimler-Benz, decided to double down on Trenton, but not on the old building. They built a new facility adjacent to the old one, the Trenton South Plant. The contrast between the two buildings was jarring. It was a visual representation of the evolution of industry. Trenton South was everything the North Plant wasn't. It was bright. It was airy. It was filled with Japanese and German robotics that moved with silent, terrifying precision. The floors were polished white concrete. The workers wore clean uniforms. It was sterile. It was quiet. It was designed to build the new Pentastar V6, a high-tech aluminum block engine for the modern world. For a few years, the two plants existed side by side, separated only by a parking lot and a fence line. On one side, you had the Old North, dark, dirty, smelling of hot iron and oil. Chugging along, building the last of the iron block engines, the 3.3 and 3.8-litre V6s, and the 4.0-litre inline-6 for the Jeep Wrangler. It was a zombie, kept alive by demand, staffed by the veterans who had survived the layoffs of the 80s. On the other side, you had the New South, gleaming, efficient, the future. It was a strange, purgatorial existence for the workers in the North Plant. They could look out the windows, the ones that hadn't been painted over or broken, and see the future right next door. And they knew, deep down, that they weren't part of it. The investment wasn't going into their lines. The new tools weren't coming to their stations. They were running out the clock. Then came the Great Recession of 2008. The financial world collapsed. Credit froze. And Chrysler, for the second time in 30 years, went bankrupt. This wasn't a reorganization. This was a near-death experience. The company effectively ceased to exist and was reborn under the management of Fiat. Sergio Marchionne, the new CEO, was a man who wore black sweaters and smoked cigarettes and hated inefficiency. He looked at the books. He looked at the capacity. He saw that Chrysler had too many engine plants and not enough money. He made the call that everyone knew was coming, but everyone dreaded. The old North Plant had to die. There was no ceremony. There was no parade. In May of 2011, the silence finally came. The last iron block engine rolled off the line at Trenton North. The workers shut down the machines. They locked their toolboxes. The furnaces, which had burned with the fire of 1,000 suns for 60 years, were allowed to go cold. The silence that fell over the North Plant wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the silence of a tomb. Chapter 7. The Erasure. When a factory closes, it usually sits for a while. It enters a twilight phase. Security guards patrol the perimeter. The lights stay on in the hallways. It looks like everyone just went home for the weekend and forgot to come back. But Trenton North didn't sit for long. The decision was made to demolish it. And demolish is too soft a word. They erased it. The demolition of a massive industrial facility is a violent act. It is a reverse construction. It is the undoing of history. In 2011 and 2012, the heavy equipment arrived. Huge hydraulic excavators with shearing claws that could cut through steel beams like scissors through paper. They started at the edges and worked their way in. They ripped through the Albert Kahn monitor roofs, shattering the glass that had once flooded the floor with daylight. They crushed the brick walls that had shielded the secrets of the Hemi. They tore up the concrete floors where the Challengers and the Cudas and the Roadrunners were born. It was a slow, grinding destruction. Locals would drive by on Van Horn Road and see the skeleton of the beast being picked clean. The steel girders were twisted and piled up for scrap. The copper wiring, miles and miles of it, was ripped from the walls and recycled. The machinery, the presses, the lathes, the dynos were hauled away on flatbed trucks destined for scrap yards, or in some cases, sold to factories in China or India to start a new life. It was a humiliating end for a place that had once commanded so much respect. The place that had literally changed the weather with its sirens was now being chewed up and spit out by machines that didn't care about heritage. And even after the building was gone, the work wasn't finished. They had to dig up the dirt. They had to remediate the soil. They had to excavate the toxic legacy of 50 years of horsepower. Thousands of tons of contaminated soil were dug up and hauled away to hazardous waste landfills. They literally scooped out the earth to purge the memory of the pollution. For the people of Trenton, watching the North Plant come down was like watching a mountain disappear. It had always been there. It was the landmark. It was the economic anchor. It was the reason the town existed. And then, suddenly, it was just air. Today, if you drive past the site, the contrast is absolute. To the south, the new plant hums along. It's a good plant. It provides good jobs. It builds good engines that power the Jeep Wranglers and the Ram trucks you see on the road every day. It is a success story of modern manufacturing. But if you look next to it, you see the void. The site of the old North Plant is largely empty. It is a flat, grey scar on the landscape. They left the concrete slab in many places, a tombstone too heavy to move. Nature is trying to reclaim it. Weeds push through the cracks in the pavement where fork lifts once raced. Geese land in the puddles that form in the depressions where the heavy presses once stood. It is quiet. Chapter 8. The Ghost in the Machine. But for those who know what happened here, that silence is deafening. This empty lot isn't just vacant land. It is a graveyard. It is where the American century redlined. This is where the sheer, unadulterated power of Detroit was forged. This is where men and women ruined their backs and their hearing to build the machines that defined freedom for a generation. The dark story of the Trenton Engine Plant isn't just about pollution or bankruptcy or demolition. It is about the price of progress. It is about what we leave behind. We demand newer, cleaner, faster, more efficient things. We demand 30 miles per gallon. We demand safety ratings. We demand engines that don't leak oil and don't wake up the neighbors. And we get them. The Pentastar V6 built next door is, by every objective metric, a better engine than the 440 Magnum. It creates more power per litre. It lasts longer. It burns cleaner. But in exchange for that perfection, we had to let go of the grit. We had to let go of the fire. We had to let go of the chaotic, dangerous, wonderful energy that lived in the old North Plant. We traded the soul for the statistic. The silent engine giant is sleeping now. The roaring dyno rooms are gone. The Hemi is a collector's item kept in climate-controlled garages, too valuable to drive. The shop rats are retired or passed on. But the energy remains. You can't run that much power through a piece of land without leaving a charge. If you stand by that fence line on Van Horn Road on a quiet Tuesday night, when the wind dies down and the traffic fades, and you listen closely, you can almost hear it. You can hear the thrum of the furnaces. You can hear the scream of the cutting tools. You can hear the ghost of a 440 six-pack screaming at redline refusing to die. Rest in power, Trenton North.